In the winter of 1964, on the morning of her 18th birthday, Elsie Marsh woke before the bell for the last time. She had woken before the bell for as long as she could remember. It was a habit the other girls teased her for, in the years when there were still girls her age to tease her. You got 10 minutes to yourself before the day was handed out in portions, and Elsie had learned early that 10 minutes you took quietly was worth more than anything you asked for out loud. She made her bed so flat and square that a stranger walking through the dormitory would not have known which one had held a girl for 18 years. Then she sat on the edge of it with her hands in her lap and waited for the day to come and get her. St. Agnes Home for Children stood at the edge of a gray coastal county, behind a wall with glass set into the top of it, and it was not a cruel place. That was the thing Elsie found hardest to explain, later, to people who wanted the story to be simpler than it was. Nobody had beaten her, nobody had starved her. The home was clean and cold and correct, and it raised its children the way you would raise a fence, straight, useful, without one wasted nail. At 8:30, she stood in the front office with her cardboard suitcase on the table, and Matron Ashworth went through it. That was the rule. Every leaver's case was checked to see that nothing belonging to the home went out the gate inside it. The matron lifted out each folded thing and set it aside. 2 dresses, mended. A jumper darned at both elbows in wool that did not quite match because there had been no mother to choose the wool. A comb with 4 teeth gone, a Bible she had been issued at 7 and told to keep. Through the doorway. On the stairs. 3 of the small girls stood watching through the banister rails, the way small girls watch everything. The matron repacked the case herself, each item squared to the next, correct to the last fold, and closed the lid. Then she unlocked the deep drawer of her desk and took out 2 things Elsie had never seen. The first was a card of stiff, yellowed board, ruled like a ledger, with 1 line of ink on it, a date from the winter of 1946, a signature, and the stamp of St. Agnes. 1 sealed envelope, entered among the child's personal effects, release at 18. The second was the envelope. It was small and brown, and it had been sealed so long that the flap had gone the color of weak tea. On the front, in a hand that shook, were 7 words, for the child, to be opened by her, at 18, not before. The matron laid it on the suitcase and looked, for once, directly at Elsie. The instructions said 18, she said. You're 18. That was the whole ceremony. 18 years. And the instructions said 18, and she was 18, and so it was done. Elsie picked up the envelope and found that her hand was not steady, and made it steady, because the matron was watching, and Elsie had learned a long time ago that the home fed on what it saw. At the gate, the porter let her through, and the iron closed behind her with the sound it had always made, which she had never once heard from the outside. She stood on the road in the cold with her breath going up white. Inside, faint through the wall, the breakfast bell rang, and Elsie understood, standing there, that the bell was no longer ringing for her. There were 61 places laid at the long tables this morning. Yesterday there had been 62. The home had already closed over the space where she used to be, the way water closes over a stone. She did not cry. Crying belonged to the girl who still slept behind that gate, and she did not sleep there anymore. She was picking up the case when she heard feet on gravel, and the little kitchen girl came around the gate post at a half run, looked back once at the windows, and pushed a parcel into Elsie's hands. Bread, wrapped in newspaper, still warm at the center. Then she was gone, because kitchen girls were not allowed at the gate, and neither of them had said a word. Elsie stood holding warm bread outside a locked gate. 18 years old, with 3 pounds saved from scrubbing floors, a wool coat with a safety pin where a button should have been, and an envelope that had waited for her through all but the first weeks of her life. She walked to the bus stop and opened it there, on the bench, with cold fingers. There was no letter inside, no name, no photograph. There was a scrap of paper with a single line on it, written in the same shaking hand as the front of the envelope. The name of a village, that was all. A village she had never heard of, on no road she knew. And there was a small brass tag, heavy for its size, stamped with a number. Its edges had darkened with age, and the stamped number was still sharp beneath her thumb. It was not a coin, and it was not a medal, and it fit no purpose she could think of. And it was, as far as Elsie Marsh knew, the only object on this earth that connected her to whoever she had been before St. Agnes wrote her down. Her file said one thing about that, and she had read it once, at 15, when a kind clerk left the folder open a moment too long. Brought in, a few weeks old, mother declined to give her name. Declined, not unknown, declined. Somebody had stood in that office holding her, and been asked and said no. Elsie had spent 3 years deciding how she felt about that word, and had not finished. She looked at the name of the village until she had it by heart. Then she went to the ticket window. Because there was nowhere else in the world she was expected, and no other door on earth had ever been left ajar for her. Even this much. The clerk behind the window ran his finger down the timetable twice. "That place," he said. "Nobody's gone out there since they pulled the trains. Love, might as well ask for a ticket to last year." He sold her one as far as the timetable went, which was a market town 20 miles short, and told her somebody out that way would know the rest. Somebody out that way did not. A woman at the market town pointed her confidently up the wrong road, and Elsie walked an hour and a half before a postman turned her around, and by then the last coastal bus had gone, and the light was going with it. That was the first day. She ate half the kitchen girl's bread on a bench by the market cross, and wrapped the other half back in its newspaper and put it in the case. She had learned, in 18 years of issued portions, never to finish what she had. Finished meant empty. Empty meant asking, and Elsie Marsh did not ask. The second day she got the second lesson, which was that £3 is not money. It is a countdown. The wrong bus had cost her. A cup of tea and the cheapest thing on a cafe board cost her more. By afternoon, she was standing at the back door of a roadside cafe that was closing, and she made herself knock. And when the woman opened it, Elsie said the sentence she had rehearsed the whole way up the path. "I'm not asking for food, ma'am. I'm asking for work. 2 hours of washing for 1 plate. I'm quick." The woman looked at her a long moment, not at her face, at her hands, which were cracked red across the knuckles from cold water. The hands of a girl who had scrubbed for her keeps and she was tall enough to reach a sink. Then she stood aside from the door. Elsie washed for 2 hours and did it properly. And when she came out of the scullery, there was a plate on the corner table with 3 times the food her 2 hours were worth. "I only worked for a small plate," Elsie said. "Then eat the rest as a favor to me," the woman said, going back to her counter. "It's a sin to waste it." Elsie ate all of it, slowly, and did not know what to do with the tightness in her chest, and decided it was the heat of the room. She slept that night in the waiting room of a dead railway station. She did not know, when she chose it, what it was. It was simply a stone building with a bench and a roof, off the road, out of the wind. It was only in the gray of the morning, standing on the platform with her case, that she saw the rails below her running away in both directions, with grass growing up between them, and the station board still hanging over the door with the name of a place nobody could buy a ticket to anymore. The trains had been pulled off half the little lines in the country in those years. It was in all the papers, the men in London with their figures, the branch lines that did not pay. What the figures did not say was what happened afterward. Out at the far ends of those lines, where the last train had left and everything behind it had begun, quietly, to die. Elsie stood on the dead platform and did not know she was looking at the beginning of her own story. She only knew it was the loneliest place she had ever slept, and that it had kept the rain off, and that both of those things were true at once. The third night she asked at a sheep farm, properly, at the door, and the farmer looked at her the way the cafe woman had hands first and let her sleep in the hay barn. In the morning she forked the hay back square where she had flattened it, so that the barn looked as though no one had ever been there. She left every place the way she left every place, as if she had never been in it. It was the one thing the home had taught her that she meant to keep. It was the fish lorry that finally knew the way. She had asked at the market town depot until asking was pointless, and she was standing at the Coast Road junction in the wind when the lorry pulled in for diesel, and the driver heard her say the name of the village to the pump man and leaned out of his cab. "Selwick," he said, "I pass through there twice a week. Get in, then, before you take route." I was a big, quiet man who drove with one wrist on the wheel, and the cab smelled of fish and engine oil and cigarettes, and for 10 miles he said nothing at all, which suited them both. Then the road came up over a rise, and the sea was suddenly there, gray to the edge of the world, and he started to talk the way men do when there is something large to not look at. The village had been a proper little port once, he said. Coastal boats in and out, fish going up the branch line packed in ice, a harbor full of masts. Then the line closed. Village died the day they tore up the rails, he said. Just nobody's told it yet. The young ones had gone where the work went. What was left was old men and boats that went out from habit. "You'll be wanting lodgings," he said, and laughed. "Short. Lodgings. That village is old men and seagulls. Lass, what's your business out there, if you don't mind me asking? I don't know yet, Elsie said, which was the truth. They came around a headland, and she saw it. Far off, small against the sky, a white tower on the cliff above a fold in the coast, straight as a candle somebody had forgotten to throw away. Is that a lighthouse? She said. The driver's face changed. It was a small change, the kind you would miss if you had not spent 18 years reading the faces of people who decided things about you. Dark now, he said, since the old man died. And that was all he said. For the last 3 miles of road he could take her, and she knew better than to ask. At a junction where a lane dropped away toward the sea, he pulled up and pointed past her, down the old track bed that ran along the cliffs. From here you walk the old rail line, 3 miles. You'll make it before dark. Just... She thanked him. He waved it off with 2 fingers and was gone in a smell of fish and diesel. And Elsie Marsh picked up her cardboard suitcase and walked the last 3 miles of her old life along a railway with no rails. The sleepers were still down in places, half swallowed. Grass ran up the middle of the track bed like a seam. The sea lay on her right hand the whole way, gray and patient, and the wind came off it with salt in it, and gulls hung over her without effort, watching her the way everything in that country seemed to watch, without hurry and without much hope. Then the track bed swung around the last shoulder of cliff, and the village lay below her. A dozen streets of gray stone folded into the bay. A harbor wall holding a handful of boats, smoke standing up from some of the chimneys and not from others. And above it all, on the headland across the bay, the tower, white gone gray, streaked with rust under the gallery rail, its lamp room glass catching the last of the light and giving nothing back. Elsie stood on the old line with the wind pulling at her coat, and in her pocket the little brass tag lay against her fingers like a coal. She did not know yet why she had come. She only knew that in 18 years, nothing had ever waited for her, and something here had... The tea room by the harbor was the only lit window in the village by the time she came down into it. The sign over the door said Harbor Tea Room in paint that had been renewed by hand, in the same letters, for a long time. Inside there were 6 tables, a coal stove, 2 old men playing dominoes without urgency, and a woman behind the counter with reading glasses on a chain and a red wool scarf, who looked up when the bell went and took the whole of Elsie in the case. The wet shoes, the coat with its safety pin in the time it took the door to close. Elsie sat at the smallest table and ordered the cheapest thing on the board, which was a cup of tea, and counted the pennies onto the saucer so there would be no question of it. The woman brought the tea, beside it, without comment. She set down a plate with 2 slices of bread and butter that nobody had ordered. "Where's your people?" "Then," she said. It was not nosiness. It was the first question of that country, asked the way you ask about weather. "Away," Elsie said. It was not a lie. It was a door she had learned to close politely, and she had been closing it her whole life. And the woman looked at her for a moment, as if she could see the door and the hinges and everything behind it, and decided not to knock. "Maureen," she said instead, and went back to her counter. At the domino table, one old man said to the other, "Lo, something about Arthur's Tower." She caught only that much, the name and the word, and the other man looked over at her. The stranger. And the talk went out like a lamp. Elsie drank her tea and pretended she had heard nothing, which was another thing she was good at, when she paid. The bread and butter was not on the bill. She started to say so. Maureen was already turned away, wiping a counter that didn't need it. "Nobody locks the net shed at the top of the slip," Maureen said, to the counter. Not that I said so. The net shed smelled of tar and rope, and the coiled nets made a bed softer than some she had known. And Elsie slept that first night in the village the way she had slept in every strange place in her life, with her shoes set beside her head and one strap of the case looped over her wrist. Because a girl who has been moved without warning learns to sleep ready. In the morning she saw the notice. It was pinned behind the glass of the council board by the post office, typed, and gone yellow at the edges from months of being ignored. She read it once, and then she read it standing very still. "For sale by the council. A decommissioned council-owned harbor light, together with keeper's cottage and land pertaining. Built when the fishing port still handled coastal traffic, sold at the nominal sum of £1. The purchaser to assume all obligations of maintenance and repair. Transfer conditional upon the said obligations being met." There was more, in smaller type, about liability and about the parish, and at the bottom there was a reference number for the property, stamped by some office machine. Elsie took the brass tag out of her pocket and held it up beside the glass. The number on the tag was not the same number, but it was the same kind of number, the same style, the same stamp, the same way of writing something down so that an office could find it again. The tag in her hand and the tower on the notice came from the same drawer of the same world. She stood in front of that board for a long time, while the village went past behind her to the extent that it still went anywhere. Then she walked to the post office window and asked how a person got to the council offices, and the postmistress looked at her, and then at the board, and then back at her, and said, "You're never—" "The bus, or is it walking?" Elsie said. She rode the mail van to the town, in the end, sitting among the sacks. The council offices were brown inside, brown wood and brown linoleum, and the smell of brown soup somewhere. And it took an hour and 3 sets of initials before she stood in front of the desk that mattered, which belonged to a tired man in a gray raincoat he had not taken off indoors, whose nameplate said Emmer R. Wick. He read the notice reference. He looked at her 18, cracked hands, a coat with a safety pin for longer than was comfortable. "You understand what this is," he said. "It's not a house, miss, it's a decommissioned light. There's no power up there now, no water you'd want. A cottage with a roof I wouldn't stand under. And a tower, the surveyor's report calls unsound. The pound is not the price. The pound is the bait. What you're buying is the obligation." "I can read," Elsie said, not sharply. It was simply true, and she was tired of rooms like this one deciding things over her head. "Mr. Wick looked at her a moment longer, then he slid the form across the desk, because the council had wanted rid of the thing for 2 years, and a signature was a signature, and it was not his job to save people from their own names. She signed. She laid a £1 note on the desk, nearly half of everything she had left, and watched it go into a tin cash box like any other pound in the world. "It's your pound, miss," Wick said, stamping the form, "and your roof when it falls in." Nobody in the office laughed. It was worse than laughing. It was the polite English silence of a room full of people deciding not to watch you make a mistake. And it followed her out the door and all the way down the brown stairs. Elsie Marsh walked out of the council offices owning one decommissioned harbor light, a dying cottage, and the headland they stood on. And she had a little more than £1 left in the world, and the strange thing, she would try to explain it to someone, years later. And fail. The strange thing was that on the mail van home, with the sacks against her knees, she felt lighter than she had ever felt in her life. She had never in 18 years owned anything the home could not check in a suitcase. Now she owned a tower. The path up the headland left from the top of the harbor slip and climbed along the cliff in 20 minutes of proper climbing. And she made it with her case in her hand because there was nowhere else the case lived now. The tower grew as she came, until she was standing at the foot of it with her neck bent back, and the gallery rail was rust against the moving sky. And the whole white column of it seemed to lean when the clouds went over, the way towers do. The door at the base was oak, and the council key turned in it, and inside was a round room of stone with a spiral stair going up into shadow, and the cold of a building that has not been warm in 2 years, a cold with age in it. She was still standing in that first round room when she heard boots on the path, and a voice ahead of them. "Somebody ought to see if the new owner's still breathing up here. How is old 75 if he was anything in a canvas coat too heavy for the day, with a short white beard and hands that had done work for 60 years. And the first finger of his left hand was short by 1 joint. He carried an electric torch, a jug of water, and a parcel of sandwiches he set on the stair without explanation. "Maureen sent the sandwiches," he said. "She'll deny it. You are. Tom Bray. I kept this place up for Arthur Penhale near enough 30 years. Roofs, drains, the generator. While there was one." He looked around the stone room, and something in his face was like a man visiting a grave. "Nobody's touched it since he died, 2 winters back." And then the dog came. He came up the path behind Tom at his own pace, a black and white collie gone gray at the muzzle, 1 ear up and 1 folded, moving stiff in the hips, and he walked past them both as if they were furniture, and climbed 3 turns of the spiral stair, and lay down on a particular step with a long breath, in a hollow that a century of keeper's boots had worn into the stone, and that an old dog, Elsie realized, with a small cold feeling, had claimed for his own these 2 winters past. "That's Bosun," Tom said. "Arthur's. I feed him. He lives at my fire, when it suits him." He looked up the dark of the stair, "and he's done that since the old man died. 2 years. I stopped dragging him home." They went up together, Tom naming the rooms as the stair gave onto them: the storeroom, the oil room, Empty now. Arthur's living room, one turn below the top, with an iron bed and a shelf of sea books and an enamel kettle sitting on a dead stove. Everything squared away, the way a solitary man squares a small room he means to live in forever. And then, on the last turn before the lamp room, the stair passed a door, and Bosun got up from wherever he had been and came and lay down in front of it. It was a low, heavy door of oak, older looking than the rest of the joinery, with a brass lock plate polished in the middle by a century of hands. Elsie tried the council keys in it, all of them, one after another, while Tom stood on the stair below her, saying nothing in a way that grew louder the longer it went on. "What's this room?" "The log room." Tom rubbed the back of his neck. That was his own. He lived out of the whole tower, but that room was his, and he kept it locked. And I'll tell you what I told the council when they came up here after he passed, wanting an inventory. He met her eye. Steady. I told them it was old paper and spoiled oil, and nobody argues to break a door for old paper. Was it old paper? I don't know what it is. Lass, 30 years I worked for that man. I never once set foot in it. He was quiet a moment. He said to me one time the last winter, this was he said, "If I go before it's time, leave that door be. It's not mine to open," he says, "and it's not yours either." "Whose is it, then?" He didn't say. Tom picked up his torch, and I didn't ask. That was the whole arrangement of knowing Arthur Penhale. Come down before you freeze. You can't sleep up here tonight with no fire, and don't tell me otherwise, because I promised Maureen I'd bring word you were settled, and I'm more afraid of her than I am of you. That was how the village took her in sideways, deniably, one sandwich and one net shed and one lie to a council at a time. She settled into the pattern of it inside a week, because pattern was the thing she knew how to do. Before light, she was on the harbor, washing fish trays and mending net for the boats that still went out. Shilling work, sixpence work, her cracked hands cracking further in the salt water, and her pay counted out into 3 envelopes each night in the net shed by candle. Coal, bread, tomorrow. Mid-morning through the afternoon, she was at the tea room, washing up and wiping down, and Maureen paid her by the day. And on the first Friday, Maureen counted out the coins and pushed 2 extra shillings across the counter, and Elsie pushed them back. "I counted my hours," Elsie said, "and I counted your work." Maureen pushed the coins across again, harder. "Don't you argue with the woman who pays you, love." On the second Friday, Elsie laid coins on the counter unasked. Maureen looked at them. "What's this?" "The bread and butter," Elsie said. "My first night, it wasn't on the bill." Maureen looked at her for a long moment, over the top of the reading glasses. Then she took the coins, all of them, the full price, not a farthing forgiven, and rang them into the till one by one. It was, though neither of them would have had a word for it, the most respectful thing anyone had done for Elsie Marsh in years. Maureen had looked at a proud girl and charged her full price. They both knew what it meant, neither said it. From Tom, in the 3rd week, she bought a storm lantern. He had 2, and she had seen them in his shed, and she offered for the older one. And he named a fair price and took her money seriously, coin by coin, and gave no discount. "A gift breaks," he said, by way of philosophy. "A bought thing lasts." She carried the lantern up the headland that evening and set it, unlit, on the shelf inside the tower door, and it was the first object she had ever owned that was for a purpose she could not name. Because the truthful answer, the answer she was not ready to say even in her own head, was that she had bought light, for a particular door, for a particular hour that was coming, the way weather comes, whether you name it or not. The village talked. Of course, it was a village, she heard herself referred to, through the tea-room wall, as the lass up the light, and once, memorably, as Arthur's ghost's lodger. And one evening near closing, one of the domino men 3 pints along at the anchor first. By the smell of him leaned back in his chair and said, "To nobody." March of 51, I'll say it if no one else will, March of 51, if that light hadn't, and his partner's boot found his ankle under the table, and the sentence died. And the dominoes clicked, and Elsie wiped the same clean table 3 times and filed it away. March of 51, if that light hadn't, every day, a dozen times a day. She passed the log room door. She was carrying pails past it. She was sweeping the stair. She would find herself standing in front of it at dusk with no memory of having climbed to it. And Bosun would be there before her, or arrive after her, and sit, and look at the door, and then at her, waiting, in the manner of a creature who has been waiting for 2 years and can do it a while longer. And she would take the brass tag out of her pocket and hold it against the lock plate. It did not fit. It was not a key, but it was the right size and the right brass and the right age, and it sat against that plate the way a word sits against the tip of your tongue. She told herself she was waiting for a free morning. She told herself she was waiting for better light than a candle. Both of those were true. Neither was the truth. The truth was that she knew the way you know weather. Before there is a cloud to point it that whatever was behind that door was going to change what she understood about her own life. And a person can only walk through a door like that once. It was Tom who ended the waiting, without meaning to. Or perhaps she never settled it meaning to entirely. It was a Tuesday, near dark. She had climbed to the door again on some errand she had already forgotten, and she had the tag in her hand, pressed flat to the brass plate, her thumb going over the stamped number, as it had done every day since the bus stop, and she heard him on the stair, and turned, and Tom Bray was standing 3 steps down with the torch in his hand, looking at the little brass crown pressed against Arthur's lock. He stood absolutely still, a man his age, on a stair, in bad light, and she watched something go through his face that took 2 years to cross it. Then he turned around and went down the stairs and out of the tower without one word, and she heard his boots die away on the path, and she stood there with her heart going, understanding nothing except that something had happened. He came back in the morning. He was carrying a wooden tool chest, Arthur's, the one he had kept at his own fireside for 2 winters, and he set it on the table in the storeroom with a care that had nothing to do with its weight. "He told me," Tom said. His voice was not quite right. "The last winter. He says to me, keep my tool chest, Tom, and if someone ever comes carrying the brass crown, give her the box. Ask nothing." He looked at her, and his eyes were an old man's eyes, wet at the rims from more than wind. 2 years I've had that box at my fire. I never knew what it meant. I never looked. He said, ask nothing. So I asked nothing. That was the whole arrangement of knowing Arthur Penhale. He lifted the tray of tools out. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in an oiled rag, was a piece of brass the length of a finger. It was the body of a key, the shaft and the cut bit, machined clean with no bow, no crown, nothing to turn it by, only a squared socket at the top and a small locking screw. Elsie took the tag from her pocket with fingers that were not steady and did not try to be. The tag slid onto the socket like a word finding its sentence. The little screw drew it tight. And what lay in her palm then was one whole key, made in 2 parts by a careful man at a bench, the crown darkened by 18 years inside a sealed envelope, and the body kept oiled by 2 years of an old man's loyalty. And neither of its keepers had ever known what they were keeping. Tom looked at it a long time. "Aye," he said at last, very quietly. "Then it's yours to open." She did not open it that night, and she did not open it with Tom on the stair, and afterward she was glad of both. She waited for Sunday, when the tea room closed and the harbor rested and the day was hers from its first hour. She slept badly and gave up on it before midnight and lay in Arthur's narrow iron bed 1 turn below the door, listening to the wind work at the gallery rail. A little after 1 in the morning she sat up and pulled her boots on, and Bosun was awake at the door of the room before her feet touched the floor. As if the dog had been waiting not just 2 years but for this specific night of it. She lit the storm lantern she had bought with her own worked wages and carried it up the last turn of the stair and set it on the step, and its light threw the old door up out of the dark every grain of the oak, the polished center of the brass plate, the keyhole she had never once seen in honest light. The 2-part key was whole in her hand. Her hand was steady. She noticed that and understood it. The shaking had all been spent in the waiting, and what was left now was only the door. The key went in smooth, all the way, like the lock had been oiled in waiting. She turned it, and for 1 heartbeat nothing moved, and her chest dropped, and then, deep in the old mechanism, something shifted and caught and gave, and the bolt drew back with a soft, heavy sound she felt in her wrist more than heard. The door of the log room came loose from its frame and swung inward into the dark. The air was close and dry, carrying old paper, lamp oil, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco, 2 years shut, and the room still smelled like a man who had stepped out and meant to come back. Bosun went in past her legs, straight, without hesitating, to a hollow of worn floorboard beneath the table, and turned twice, and lay down in it with 1 long breath like a dog lying down in the one place he had spent 2 years trying to get back to. Elsie raised the lantern and went in after him. It was a small, round room, and it was not a ruin. And it was not a mystery. It was an office, a working man's office, kept the way Arthur had kept every room she had seen squared away, ready, waiting. A table under the shuttered window, a chair pushed in, a tin of pens, and around the curve of the wall, shelf above shelf above shelf, the logbooks, 40 years of them, cloth-bound, uniform, each spine inked with its years in the same upright hand. She took one down from the middle of the wall, the way you would take down a sleeping thing, and opened it on the table in the lantern light, and met Arthur Penhale for the first time. The entries were a keeper's entries. Weather, oil, wicks, glass, wind, NNE, freshening, lamp lit, 1640, all well, page after page, year on year. The patient bookkeeping of a man holding a light against the dark on a schedule, and in among them, every few pages, set down in the same flat hand with no more ceremony than the weather, were the other entries. Fog 9 hours, rang the bell till my arm gave, both boats in, nobody the wiser, good. Pulled 3 off the rocks past midnight, gave them the floor and the stove till morning, no report filed, men are ashamed enough without paperwork. Lad off the coal boat, put ashore drunk and left, kept him the week, dried him out, sent him home on the Friday bus with his fare and a word, his mother wrote after, kept the letter. She read standing up. And then she read sitting down. And then she read with her coat over her shoulders and the lantern trimmed low. Book after book, hour after hour, while the wind went around the tower and the old dog breathed under the table. There was a rhythm to it that she came to know. The sea took, and the light held, and every so often the sea put someone on Arthur's rocks or Arthur's doorstep instead of taking them, and Arthur wrote them down, not for the council, not for any office. The reports that mattered were never filed. He wrote them down the way you write down what you cannot say to anyone, so that somewhere in the world it was at least recorded. That on such a night, such a person had come in off the water with nothing and been kept. One entry she read 3 times, from a January years back. The hollow girl and her father. Engine gone in the swell off the point. Kept the beam on them 4 hours till the tide turned them home. She waved at the tower every day after, going to school, rain or no. I minded that more than I let on. Somewhere in the middle of the night. Elsie stopped reading and sat back in Arthur's chair with her hands flat on the table, and understood the thing the whole village had been not saying since the day she arrived. The council had decommissioned a lamp. Nobody had told them it was a man's whole heart. If you've come this far with Elsie, take 1 second to subscribe. Because what she found next is the reason I'm telling you this story. She was reaching to trim the lantern when she saw it. The bottom shelf, in the shadow of the table, held no logbooks. It held a wooden box of tools for the lamp, a coil of wick, a spare glass, and pushed to the back, flat, a book that was not like the others, smaller, bound in oilcloth against damp and tied shut with tarred string, the knots of a man who did not intend it opened by accident. She knew before she touched it, she would say that, later. To the one person she ever told all of it, that her hands knew before she did, because they had gone cold. She untied it at the table, in the lantern light, with the dog watching her from the floor. The first entry was dated in the winter of 1946. The hand was Arthur's, but pressed harder. The letters driven into the page. Storm from the northeast, worst in years. Went down at first light to check the slip and found a girl at the foot of the tower. Wet through, half frozen, no bag, no coat worth the name, young, and carrying a child, far along. She begged me not to send for anyone, not the doctor, not the vicar, especially not the constable. I asked her nothing. Her hands told enough. Elsie read that entry and did not move for a long time. Then she turned the page. Hy had kept her the girl from the storm the way he kept everything. Quietly and squared away and off every record but this one. He gave her the living room and took the storeroom floor for himself. He walked to the village for 2 of everything and let them think a keeper eats double in winter. The entries were 2 lines, 3 lines, days apart. She slept the clock round. Good. She watches the door. All day she watches the door. I have moved the chair so it watches the door for her. She sat by the west window today, the full hour, and never looked at the door once. First time. And then, in an entry from the turn of that year, a name, Grace. She gave it to me tonight like she was handing over something breakable. I'll not write the rest of what she told me. Enough that he has asked after her in 2 towns down the coast already. She is not afraid he will find her. She is afraid he will understand what the child is worth to him, a rope to pull her back with. I have never seen fear shaped like that. It thinks ahead. Elsie sat in the cold round room with her own 2 hands pressed flat on the table. and 18 years of a locked file mother declined to give her name began, line by line, to open. The child came in the last storm of that winter. The child came at 4 in the morning, in the lamp room, because it was the only warm floor in the tower. No getting to the town in that sea, no doctor, no one but the two of us and the weather. I have docked boats in gales. I have never had a night like it. A girl, loud as the wind and twice as stubborn. Good signs, both. Mother and child asleep by dawn, and I sat on the stair and shook like a green hand, and the lamp wanted trimming, and I trimmed it. Elsie Marsh set the book down on the table, and got up, and could not stand, and sat down on the floor instead, on the worn boards, next to the old dog. She was sitting in the room she had been born above. She had scrubbed the stair that had carried her mother up it. She had passed that lamp room 100 times with pails and rags, and stood in it wondering at the dead lens. And it was the first floor she had ever lain on in this world, and no one alive had known it, no one but a locked book on a bottom shelf, in a locked room, in a tower that a county had sold for £1 because nobody wanted it. The wind went around the tower. The lantern burned. The dog put his gray head against her knee, and she held on to him. And for a while the log room kept its last secret politely to itself and let her breathe. When she could read again, she read the rest. Grace stayed through the child's first weeks, and the entries from those weeks were the shortest in the book and the easiest to read. Both well. Both well. Child has a grip on her like a shackle. Both well. And then the entries turned, the way weather turns, and Elsie read them with her jaw set, because she could feel where they were going. He had been seen asking. A town 12 miles off this time. Grace knew, the way that fear of hers knew everything early, that a woman with an infant is remembered in every shop and every pew, that two of them together made a trail a blind man could follow, and that the child was the rope. As long as the child was with her, there was a rope. The entry that ended it was longer than any other in the book, and Arthur's hand in it was very steady, the way a hand is steady when it has decided to be. We settled it tonight, and I will put it down plain, because someone someday has a right to read it plain. She will take the child to St. Agnes, in the county town, where they know how to keep a record and how to keep it shut. She goes alone. She gives no name not hers, and none from me, for a single man's name against a foundling is a question, and questions are a trail. With the child goes one envelope, sealed, and on it her instruction to be opened by her at 18, not before. Inside, the name of this village, and the crown of a key. Because tonight I made the key, made it in 2 parts on the bench, body and crown, a sliding joint and a locking screw, best work I have ever done, and the worst night I have ever done it on. A lock that opens for one person only. In all this world, the crown goes with the child, the body stays with the tower. And this room stays as it is. Her beginning is in it, when she is 18, if she comes looking. This door will open for her, and for nobody else on this earth. Grace held the 2 halves of that key together in her 2 hands for a long time tonight before she could let one go. And below it, alone on the page, 1 line more. I swore it to her at this table. No letters, no visits. No man asking after a little girl, because a man asking is a signpost, and signposts can be read by anyone. 18 years. Then the door decides. Elsie read the oath twice, and then she sat back. And out of 18 years of practice at being practical, she did the arithmetic of her own abandonment one final time and found that every number in it had changed. Her mother had not left her at a gate. Her mother had carried her to the one door in England that kept records and kept them shut, and had stood in that brown office and been asked her name, and had said no declined because a name was a rope, and she was cutting every rope that led to her daughter, one by one, with both hands, including the last one, including herself. And Elsie remembered. Then, the yellowed card the matron had laid on her suitcase, one sealed envelope, entered among the child's personal effects. Release at 18, a date, a signature, a stamp. Grace had walked out of that office with empty arms and nothing in the world but the word of a bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy had kept it 18 years, through matrons and clerks and audits, correct to the last day. The same machine that had checked Elsie's suitcase at the gate and closed the breakfast list over her name had also, all that time, been standing guard over the only thing her mother had left her, because the instructions said 18. She would spend years deciding how she felt about that. She had, she suspected, already begun. There was more in the room. She found it the way you find things at the end of a long night, one drawer at a time, too tired to be afraid anymore. In the table's shallow drawer, a photograph in a plain frame, a man of about 40 in a keeper's coat, squinting into sun, with a small girl riding on his shoulders and both her hands buried in his hair. The tower behind them, younger and whiter. On the back, in the upright hand, a name and a date in 1938, and not one word more. Elsie carried it to the lantern and looked at the little girl a long time, and thought of a man who kept 40 years of logbooks and could not write one sentence under this, and set it down as gently as she had ever set anything down in her life. Tom would tell her the rest of it, in time, on a cliff path between one door and the next, the daughter. The sea. The day the boats came back without her, 1938. He never said her name after, Tom would say. Looking straight ahead, he just never let the lamp go dark. 40 years. Lass, you do the sums. In the same drawer, tied with string, a thin bundle of letters postmarked from towns that walked away down the map, a few months between them, then longer. Grace's letters, her mother's hand, rounder than Arthur's, hurried, alive. Elsie read them in order, rationing them like the last of the bread, and they were small and brave and getting smaller. Work found, work lost. A room here, a winter there. Tell me nothing about her. It is safer. Only tell me the light is on until the last one, which was different, which had a spine in it. I have decided, when the weather turns, I am coming back, not to undo anything, only to see the light, and to stand on the harbor, and to know the door I left her is still there when the weather turns. And folded behind that last letter, pressed flat by 18 years, was a cutting from a newspaper, not this county's, folded in 8. The creases gone soft as cloth from handling. A road accident, a young woman, no family come forward, and the road it named was the coast road, the stretch whose next miles led toward the village, toward the sea, toward the light. The letter had come first, the cutting had come after, and Arthur Penn Hale had folded the one behind the other so that they could never again be read apart, and had put them in the drawer of a locked room, and had gone on trimming the lamp. She was coming back. She had never stopped coming back. The road just ran out before the tide could turn. At the bottom of the drawer there was a tin box, the kind tobacco comes in, taped shut, with 4 words painted on the lid in the steady hand. For the girl, for her start. Inside was money, notes, worn soft, banded, coins gone dull. She did not count it. Under the money was a folded sheet, and on it Arthur had written what it was, something set aside from every pay packet, from the winter she was born until the winter he died. 16 years of a keeper's wages, skimmed a little at a time, the way you feed a stove in a long winter. And beneath the tin, last of all, one envelope, unsealed. Her name was not on it, because he had not known her name. It said only for her. The letter inside was 1 page, and it was dated the last winter of his life, and she read it with the lantern guttering and the dawn coming gray at the shutter's edge. I am writing this because the doctor uses careful words now, and I have kept a log too long to lie to one. You will be near 18. I do not know your name, and I find I mind that more than the rest of it. I knew you one season. You had a grip like a shackle and no respect for weather, and your mother loved you the way the sea loves the shore, which is to say completely, and from a distance, and by wearing herself away. Everything in this room is the truth, and it is yours. The money is yours. The tower will be nothing by the time you come. If you come a dead light on a dying coast, and I am sorry for that, and I have thought about it at this table many nights. And here is what I know that the council does not. The tide takes nothing it does not mean to return. Our job is only to keep the light. Arthur Penn Hale, keeper. Elsie Montmarsh sat in the log room of a tower she had bought for £1, holding a letter from the man who had caught her the night she was born. And outside the shuttered window the gulls began, and the sea kept on below the cliff, patient as ever, like something that had been holding its side of a bargain for 18 years and was not going to mention it. She came down the stair at full light with the letter still in her hand, meaning to find Tom, meaning she didn't know what she meant. She never found out, because at the foot of the headland path, in the lane, stood the council's gray van, and 2 men were getting out of it, and one of them was Mr. Wick, in his raincoat, with a clipboard, and a surveyor's tape already being walked toward her tower. "Miss Marsh," Wick said, "we need to talk about this tower." The surveyor walked the tower for an hour while Wick stood in the wind with his clipboard. And Elsie stood near him with Arthur's letter folded away inside her coat, next to her heart, like armor put on backward. Armor. The verdict came by post 3 days later, typed, with the council's stamp. And Maureen read it over Elsie's shoulder at the tea-room counter, because Elsie's hands had stopped being reliable somewhere in the second paragraph. The structure was declared unsound. The conditional transfer, she learned, in that paragraph, what she had actually signed, meant her ownership was not yet whole. It completed only if the maintenance obligations were met, and the council now defined meeting them. 3 conditions, 90 days, an independent structural survey showing the tower capable of repair, a works plan signed by a qualified man, and proof of funds to carry it out. Failing which, the property reverted whole to the council. And the council, the letter did not say, but the village said for it within a day, had a buyer waiting. A development company from up the coast had been pricing Headlands for 2 summers hotels, they said. Holiday Flats. A coast road scheme and a reverted parcel with a condemned tower on it was cheaper than a bought one. They didn't need to purchase anything from Elsie Marsh. They needed her to fail. Wick came out himself at the end of that week and stood at the foot of the tower, and he was not cruel about it, which made it worse. You bought a pound's worth of trouble. Miss, I told you what the pound was. Sign the release. Take your pound back and walk away. You're 18. Nobody in that office will think less of you. Half of them will think more. Elsie looked at him, a tired, correct man, doing a job in the wind, and asked him the only question she had. Were you ever out on that water at night? Or Wick you, or anyone you love? He did not answer. He looked at the sea for a moment, and then at his clipboard. And then he left. And Elsie noticed that he had not answered, and put the noticing away carefully. The way she put everything away. She carried one of the logbooks down to the tea room the next morning, at the busy hour, when the boats were in and the tables were full. And she did not make a speech. She stood at the counter and opened the book and read one entry aloud, in the voice you would use to read a bus timetable, because the entry did not need help. Pulled 3 off the rocks past midnight. Gave them the floor and the stove till morning. No report filed. Men are ashamed enough without paperwork. The room went quiet in a way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them is doing arithmetic at once. Then the domino man stood up, the one from that evening, March of '51, sober now and gray as the harbor, and crossed to the counter and took the book from her with both hands, the way you take a thing you are afraid of dropping, and turned the pages himself until he found the winner he wanted. His lips moved. He stopped. He stood there a long time with his thumb on the page, and then he sat down on the nearest chair, not quite meaning to, and said, to the table, That's my boat, page 41. I've a wife and 3 sons because of page 41. Nobody in the tea room spoke. Maureen, behind her counter, wiped one clean spot of it, over and over. What do you mean to do with those books, lass? Tom said at last, from the door. There are 40 years of names in that room, Elsie said. I mean to knock on every door that still has one behind it. They went together, she and Tom, because Tom could put living faces to half the entries. That one's moved up the coast, that one's under the churchyard, that one you'll want to catch before the pub opens, not after. They walked the village first and then borrowed the mail van's kindness for the farms. And door by door, that fortnight, Elsie Marsh learned what 40 years of unfiled reports look like when you deliver them by hand. A widow, at the top of the village, heard 2 sentences of an entry from 1957 and put her hand over her mouth and went away into the house and came back holding a brass compass, cradled in both hands like a bird. Her husband had borrowed it off Arthur the week his own went down with his first boat. He had meant to return it for 30 years. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Some debts keep their shape after the men who owed them are gone. One door was shut in their faces. A big man, 60, gone red before Elsie finished her second sentence. I don't talk about that night. The door banged. They were 3 steps down the path when it opened again, and the big man stood in it with his eyes wet and his jaw set and said, What do you need? At a farm inland, they found a whole family that had ridden out a January in the tower once. Engine dead, boat lost, everything lost, 3 generations of them now around one table. And the grandfather pointed his fork at a young man in a city shirt, home for the weekend, and said, This one exists because of that floor and that stove. Tell her what you do. I inspect buildings, the young man said. Structural engineer in the city. And then he was quiet for a while, looking at the logbook open on the table among the tea things, at his own family's winter written down in 3 flat lines. And Elsie watched a man read his own existence in another man's handwriting and decided to say nothing at all because the book was doing it better. And on the coast path between one door and the next, in the wind, looking straight ahead, Tom finally told her about 1938, the daughter, the sea, the boats coming back without her, the name Arthur never said again, and why a man like that had never simply come for her. For Elsie, in 18 years, why the letter she had found in the drawer, postmarked 1956, had come back sealed, stamped in a clerk's violet ink, returned to sender, not a relative, no information. He tried the once. Then, Tom said, when she told him about it, he nodded slowly, as if a 2-year wait had shifted to a place he could carry it. The year you'd have been 10, that'd be a single man, no kin, asking after a girl child. They'd have laughed him off the step before he finished the sentence. And Arthur. Tom looked at the sea. Arthur had made a promise about signposts. He had found the entry beside the returned letter in the oilcloth book. The letter came back sealed. I will not send another. A man asking after a child leaves a trail, and a trail has 2 ends. I had tried once, been refused by the machine, and understood that the machine's refusal was also, in its cold way, the fortress wall around her. So he had gone back to the only thing left to him, which was keeping the light, and the door, and the room, and the tin. The last name on their list was not in the logbooks at all. It was in Elsie's memory. From a January entry she had read 3 times The Hollow Girl, who waved at the tower every day, going to school, rain or no. The Hollow Girl was 40 now, and her name was on the front page of the county paper every week because Vera Hollow had gone away to the city and learned the trade of asking questions for a living, and had come back to run the paper her old editor left her. She drove out the same afternoon Elsie's message reached her, parked her little car on the harbor, and stood at the foot of the headland path looking up at the dark tower for a long moment before she climbed it, a quick, sharp woman with a camera on a strap and a notebook in her coat, who had once been 8 years old on a dead engine in a January swell, watching a beam of light hold her and her father to the world. She read the entries Elsie had marked, then worked through volume after volume by lamplight until the lantern needed trimming, and she was a newspaper woman and did not cry, except twice. "Here is what you need to understand about councils," she said, when she had finished. In the brisk voice she used for being kind, they don't answer to weeping. They answer to arithmetic, and they answer to being watched. The arithmetic you'll get. I heard about the engineer. The watching is mine. The council answers to paper. Miss Marsh. She tapped her notebook. I am paper. The county paper came out on the Thursday. Across the front page, above a photograph of the tower against a moving sky, ran the headline Vera had set herself. The light that kept us. She had chosen 3 entries. No more the fog bell. The 3 men off the rocks. The family and the stove, and printed them plain, in Arthur's own words, with the dates. Elsie had sat with her the night before while she chose, the oilcloth book on the table between them. Untied. Vera had read it in silence, all of it, and closed it, and tied the string herself. Not this one, Vera said. This one isn't the county's. No, Elsie said, and that was the whole conversation, and it was why. Of all the people who came into Elsie Marsh's life that year, Vera Hollow was the one she trusted first and doubted never. The letters started on the Saturday. They came addressed to the lighthouse, or the keeper's girl, or just the light, and the postmistress ran out a pigeonhole by Tuesday and started stacking them in an apple crate under the counter. They came from up the coast and down it, from the city, from a man in Canada whose brother had been the drunk lad off the coal boat. Some had money in them, most had stories. All of them said, in one hand or another, the same sentence: I never knew he was gone. I thought the light would always be there. The council meeting fell on the 4th Tuesday of the month, in the village hall, because the parcel was local business. On an ordinary month, local business drew 9 people and a dog. By 6:30 that Tuesday, the hall was full. By 7, the lobby was full behind it, and the street door was propped open so that the people on the step could hear. Boats had stayed in for it. The tea room was dark for it, closed by the first closed sign Maureen had hung on a weekday in living memory. And Maureen herself sat in the second row with her coat on and her hands folded, like a woman in church. The developer's man sat at the side, in a suit the color of wet slate, with a leather folder he never opened. Wick read the item into the record in his flat brown voice parcel. Conditions, 90 days, and asked whether there were representations from the public. Afterward. Nobody could quite agree who had stood first. What Elsie remembered was that they did not wait to be called, and they did not go to the front. They simply stood, one at a time, where they were, each in their own patch of the crowded hall, the way you stand in church to say a thing that has to be said standing. The March of 51 man stood with the logbook. Elsie had lent it to him, and he had not been parted from it since held in both hands against his chest like a breastplate. "Page 41, he said, to the council table, and had to stop, and started again. "Page 41, that's me. That's my boat. I have a wife and 3 sons and 11 grandchildren, and every last one of them is on page 41, whether their names are written or not." And he sat down hard, and his wife took his arm. The widow, from the top of the village, did not speak at all. She came forward, the only one who did, and set the brass compass on the council's baize table, gently, face up, needle swinging and settling, and went back to her seat. The hall was so quiet you could hear the needle settle. It said everything the logbook said, in one object, and Wick looked at it for a long time and didn't move it. The farm family stood all together, 3 generations, without a word between them about doing it, and the grandfather said only, "January of 49, all of us, there's more of us now," and sat. Then the young man in the city shirt stood, and he had a different voice for meetings, and he used it. "I inspect buildings for a living, gentlemen. And I'm standing here because that tower once kept my family alive. I'll survey it without a fee, if it can be saved. I'll put my name to the report." And last, when it seemed finished, when Wick had his pen up to move things along, Maureen stood. The hall went very still. Several people looked at the tea-room windows across the street, dark, as if to confirm the world had genuinely turned over. "I've fed this village 40 years, Maureen said. Her voice was the counter-voice, flat and carrying. "I know who paid and who couldn't, and who I never asked, and you'll get no names from me either." She looked straight at the council table. "That's what a village is. Mr. Wick, the tower knew it before any of us." She sat down. She took her glasses off and cleaned them on her scarf, and nobody in that hall was fooled. Somewhere in the middle of it all, after the compass, before the engineer, the developer's man had risen quietly, taken his unopened folder, and gone out the side door into the dark. Elsie watched him go and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he was not retreating. He was recosting. Men like that did not lose interest in headlands. They waited for arithmetic to fail, and 90 days was a long time for arithmetic to fail in. The council did not surrender either, because councils cannot. What Wick read out, at the end, was the same 3 conditions and the same 90 days: the survey, the plan, the funds, but read now into a room that would remember them, with a county newspaper woman writing down every word at the press table. Then Wick squared his papers and looked up, and for the first time addressed Elsie Marsh directly, in front of everyone. "That's the most this council can give you, Miss Marsh. What you do with 90 days is yours." The room did not cheer. It let out one long breath it had been holding for 2 years, and out in the dark street afterward, in the cold, among all those people who were not strangers anymore. Vera Hollow stood at Elsie's shoulder, looked at her notebook, and said, in the brisk voice, 90 days. Well, you'd best learn to hold a hammer, keeper. It was the first time anyone had called her that. The first Saturday of the 90 days. Elsie came down the spiral stair at 7 in the morning to a sound the headland had not heard in years. Engines on the lane, and voices. The fish lorry was backed up to the foot of the path with its tailgate down, loaded not with fish but with timber. And the driver, her driver, the one wrist on the wheel, was handing planks down to the March of 51 man as though the 2 of them had arranged it years ago. He caught her look and shrugged. I passed by anyway. They came all that day and every Saturday after. Boats stayed in for it when the weather let them. Ladders went up the tower's white side, and the old men of the harbor sat on upturned fish boxes at the foot of it, directing operations and contradicting each other about mortar, and being, by their own account, indispensable. The engineer came out 2 weekends running with instruments and a notebook, and crawled the tower from footing to gallery. And the report he signed said what the village had decided it would say, and what, this being the part that mattered, was also true. The tower was sound where it counted. The council's surveyor had priced the repairs. He had not weighed the stone. Maureen closed the tea room at 2 on Saturdays, the second sign of the apocalypse. The domino men said, and carried tea to the foot of the tower herself, and stood a moment each time before going back, looking up at the ladders with an expression nobody dared name. And on the first of those Saturdays, with the whole of it gathered, the ladders, the fish boxes, the tea. Elsie stood on the tower step where everyone could see her and held up Arthur's tin so the painted lid showed. For the girl, for her start, and put it, whole and uncounted, into the subscription. He said it was for my start, she said. This is my start. Vera printed the council's figure in the paper the next Thursday, the full sum the works plan needed, and the days remaining, set in a box on the front page like a tide table, and the county began, in its own stubborn ways, to answer. Envelopes came to the post office with postal orders in them, and shillings taped to cards, and one 5-pound note wrapped in a sermon. And for those who had no money, and it was a poor coast. And there were many Maureen-ruled lines in a stiff-backed exercise book and set it on the tea-room counter, and into it went the other currency 2 days' labor, promised and signed, the loan of a boat, slates off a fallen barn, a winter of coal, carded. It was the third book of the story. Though only Elsie thought of it that way. Arthur's logbooks were the record of what had been given. The oilcloth book was the record of what it had cost. Maureen's book, filling line by line on the counter of the harbor tea room, was the record of what came back. The developer's man returned in the 7th week, not to the village, to the council offices, to the brown room, with a figure for the headland a third higher than his last, on the reasoning that arithmetic which cannot be beaten can sometimes be bought. It was Vera who got the story, and Vera who printed Wick's answer word for word. And the village read it aloud to each other over garden walls for a week. Miss Marsh has 90 days under the contract. Until they expire, this council has nothing to sell you. The same flat brown correctness that had once slid a release form across a desk at her now stood in a doorway for her, and would not move. Elsie read it twice, and thought of a yellowed card in a matron's drawer, and understood something she suspected Wick himself did not, that she had now twice in one life been saved by the terrible patience of officials who simply did as the instructions said. They met the figure with 9 days to spare, cash and postal orders, and the priced value of every line in Bursa's in Maureen's book. Certified in the engineer's covering letter, delivered to the council by Elsie and Tom together in the fish lorry, because it seemed right that it should arrive smelling faintly of fish. Wick checked the arithmetic himself, twice, initialed the schedule, and stamped the transfer complete, and the tower, cottage, and headland passed whole and unconditional to Elsie Marsh, aged 18, of the parish. The tin box did not save the tower. It only showed the county where to begin. 2 things happened before the lighting, and Elsie told almost no one about either. The first was a journey. On a still gray Thursday near the end of that autumn, Tom drove her in his old van over the hills into the next county, to a churchyard behind a flint church on the same coast road whose seaward miles led back toward the village. It took the sexton's ledger to find the grave, because the stone was the parish's plain allowance for a young woman. No family had come forward to claim a name that was only half a name. 2 dates, and nothing else. No line about who she had been. The county had buried her, and the county had never known. Elsie had brought the photograph from the log-room drawer. She had found it tucked in the oilcloth book's back cover. Small, unposed, graced by the west window, caught turning, half laughing at the man holding the camera. In the weeks when she had stopped watching the door, Elsie propped it against the stone and sat down on the grass in her coat and stayed an hour. There was no speech. She told her mother 3 things, out loud, because the wind was the only other listener and the wind could be trusted. That the door had opened, that the light was going back on, and the third thing, which she had carried up the path of every day since the log room, and could finally set down. You were coming back. I read it. The road ran out. That's all. She put her hand flat on the cold stone, where a line should have been and wasn't. That's not the same as leaving. Then she took the photograph up again, because it belonged in the tower, in the room. On the shelf by this window, her mother had learned to sit at, and she and the old man drove home over the hills in the early dark with the heater ticking, saying nothing, in the manner of people for whom silence is a room they can both live in. The second thing happened at the tea room on a weeknight, at closing. Maureen came out from behind the counter with a tin bakery goods, she said, going spare, a sin to waste, and held it out, and stood there with her chin up, daring her. And Elsie Marsh, who had once worked 2 hours for a single plate of food, who had paid full price for bread and butter with her first wages and been right to, who had spent 18 years leaving every room as if she had never been in it. Elsie took the tin and said thank you and did not offer one thing back. It had taken her the whole story to learn how to be given something. Maureen nodded once, as at a satisfactory piece of arithmetic, and turned the sign to closed. They lit the lamp in the first week of the winter of 1965, 1 year, almost to the night, since a girl with a cardboard suitcase had walked the dead rail line into the village. The date was Elsie's choosing, and she gave the council a reason of anniversary and weather for it. And the council minuted it without curiosity, the light to be shown one night in each year, as a memorial light, by permission. The tower being no longer in the service of navigation. What she did not put in any minute was which night it was. 19 years before, on that night, a child had come at 4 a.m. on the warm floor of the lamp room, with no one there but her mother, a keeper, and the weather. Some things you do not explain. You just choose the night, and keep the reason where Arthur kept his. There were no posters, nothing in the paper. Vera's one concession to being a villager first, and a newspaper woman second. No ceremony, no speeches. The word simply went from door to door in the last days, the way a village tells itself the things that matter. And on the night, the harbor filled the way, church fills, quietly, everyone in their coats, nobody organizing anybody. Tom Bray went up the tower alone, because Elsie asked him to, and because his were the hands that had kept the machinery of it alive for 30 years. She stood below on the harbor wall, among all of them, with the 2-part key hanging at her chest on a leather cord, whole for the first time since the night Arthur made it, and never again to be parted. The lamp came on in stages, the way old machinery wakes a glow, a doubt, a steadying, and then the lens began to turn. The beam swung out over the water, one full, slow round, and came in across the harbor, and passed over their faces one by one the marchman, and his wife, and the widow, and the farm family, and the engineer, and Vera with her camera lowered, and Maureen with her glasses in her hand, and every face in that crowd did the same thing as the light crossed it, which was nothing at all, which was to stand still in the cold and be found. Nobody cheered. On the whole dark harbor there was no sound but the sea, and the old electric hum from the tower, and here and there, quietly, in the manner of that coast, someone wiping their face with the back of a glove. Elsie stood among them with the key warm under her hand and watched the beam go out and around and come back, out and around and come back, patient as tide, and understood that she was looking at the thing her mother had been coming back to see. The door I left her is still there. Only tell me the light is on. It was on. Vera raised her camera once, took the single photograph that would run above the fold that Thursday the tower alight, the harbor crowded and dark below it, and then lowered it and put it away, and stood watching like everyone else. Some nights you cover, some nights you attend. The log room. Elsie kept exactly as she found it, she had thought, in the practical part of her, about clearing it 12 rooms of tower and cottage to make something of, and every one of them needed. She could not do it, and stopped pretending she would. The logbooks stayed on their shelves. The oilcloth book stayed tied in the table drawer, with Grace's letters and the returned envelope still sealed, violet stamp and all, because some letters say everything by never being opened. The photograph of Grace at the west window stood on the shelf where the light from that window found it each afternoon, and on the table, open, lay a new logbook, cloth-bound like the others, in which, on the night of the lighting, the new keeper had made the first entry in the old format, a date, a fact, one human line. Lamp shone, one night, by permission, all of them came, all well. The keeper's cottage at the tower's foot was another matter, and what became of it took a year of Maureen's stubbornness and Vera's paperwork, and the trust's founding, the Selwick Light Preservation Trust, Maureen presiding, Tom and Vera and the engineer trustees, Elsie the keeper, and one careful correspondence with a gray institution down the coast that Elsie wrote herself, and rewrote 9 times, and posted with her jaw set. So that by the winter of 1966, 2 years since the gate of St. Agnes had closed behind a girl with everything she owned in one cardboard case, the cottage stood weather-tight and warm, 2 rooms and a stove, and was entered in the trust's book as what it was, a supervised lodging, one place, for a girl leaving St. Agnes Home for Children, taken by arrangement with the home for as long as the finding of her feet should take. The first of them came on a Friday in that second winter, on the afternoon bus that ran again now, twice a week, as far as the junction. Elsie was at the tea room when the word came down the counter, she works there still. 3 days a week, Because Maureen is not getting younger and will not hear of it. Disgust. And it happened that a traveling man at the window table, a stranger passing through, had just asked her the question of that country, the one everybody asks, the one she had spent a lifetime closing doors on. Where's your people, then, love? And Elsie Marsh, wiping the counter of the harbor tea room, with the key of the log room at her chest and the light of the headland out the window over the stranger's shoulder, heard herself give, for the first time in her life, the true answer. Here, she said. They're all here. Then the bell over the door went. The girl in the doorway was 17, thin, in a coat cut for somebody larger, and she carried a cardboard suitcase in front of her with both hands, like a shield. And her jaw was set hard against the world and everything in it, because she had been sent to an address on a paper, and she knew anyone could see she knew exactly how much addresses on papers were worth. Behind her, through the open door, the dusk was coming down the harbor, and far up on the headland the tower stood white against the last of it, and in a minute Tom would be up there putting the store lights on, and Bosun, old as the hills now, and still on the strength, would be asleep across the cottage threshold he had appointed himself to. Because every good tower needs somebody to keep the door in mind who comes in. Elsie put down her cloth and came around the counter. She knew that suitcase, she knew that coat, and that jaw, and the shoes, and the way the girl's eyes went around the room marking the exits. And she knew, to the shilling, what was in the envelopes in that case, and to the word, what door had just closed behind her, forever, with a bell ringing on the wrong side of it. She stopped in front of the girl, and smiled at her, the same smile a woman had once turned on a stranger over a plate of bread and butter, on a wet night, at this same counter, asking nothing, and said the only thing that had ever needed saying on that coast. Come in out of the cold, love, you're not late. We kept the light for you.